we say, at this hour with Senate Republicans. And we'll talk more, as we did last night, about the press. Last night, if you were here, you heard John Podhoretz and I talk about the media and Donald Trump's relationship with the media. One of our guests tonight did not agree with every syllable that was said. So we'll find out a different perspective on what's going on between Donald Trump and what I call the dominant media. And some of you don't like when I use that phrase. I actually don't have a perfect phrase to describe. Some people say legacy media or old media or traditional media. I certainly don't like mainstream media because that makes no sense under the circumstances. But we'll talk about all that. At this hour, as I said, Donald Trump is on Capitol Hill. He went up to the Capitol Hill with a giant motorcade. Let's show that. That's number 2, please. With the former and future First Lady Melania Trump. I believe they went to pay respect to Jimmy Carter, whose service President Trump will attend tomorrow. Do we have that picture of the motorcade? Let's see. There it is. That is a serious motorcade. I suspect the security in Washington tomorrow, with all the presidents in one place, will be pretty intense. And then again for the inauguration. So that's the motorcade. And then number 1, please. This is President Trump and Melania Trump arriving on Capitol Hill. There you go. Walking in.
This is new, Mark. He's walking inside now and he talks.
Okay.
He'll say something in a second.
All right, let's watch this then. Thank you, Noah.
It feels great.
Is your party all on the same page?
Couldn't feel better.
Are you willing to be military?
We're looking at the 1 bill versus 2 bills, and whatever it is, doesn't matter. We're going to get the result. And we're going to make America great again, and we'll see you in a little while.
Are you willing to take responsibility?
So as you know, 1 bill versus 2 bills is a reference to the question that's dividing Republicans still about the reconciliation process, whether they should try to figure out a way to do everything in one big bill, which would take longer, or try to do a shorter term reconciliation package that deals with primarily with immigration and defense and energy. 1 bill continues to be the dominant position, but as I said, President Trump is at this hour meeting with Senate Republicans. And that is the group that is most in favor of the 2 bill strategy, including some Trump allies. So we'll see as they come out of that meeting what he has to say about the 1 bill versus 2 bill issue. Courtesy calls back up and running, still primarily with Republican senators rather than Democrat senators. I don't have an exact count, but except for John Fetterman and a few others, there haven't been very many courtesy calls. These are the pre-confirmation meetings with the nominees with Democratic senators. There's some back and forth about whose fault that is or why that's happening. But one of the courtesy calls today involved Louisiana Senator Bill Cassidy, who is a medical doctor, and running the committee where Bobby Kennedy Jr., known to some as RFKJ, is waiting for his confirmation hearings to begin. Previous to their meeting, Senator Cassidy has said some things expressing skepticism about Bobby Kennedy's positions, particularly on vaccines. After their meeting, here's what Senator Cassidy, Senator Cassidy tweeted. The other senator from Louisiana, also a Republican, is named Senator Kennedy. So I got a little tongue-tied there. So you can take me down. There you go. All right. Had a frank conversation with HHA's nominee, RFKJ. We spoke about vaccines at length, looking forward to the hearing in Help and Finance, which is the name of the committees, the 2 committees that are in charge of confirming or evaluating the fitness of the nominee. You don't have to be a student of either Senator Cassidy or human beings to know that that is not the most enthusiastic tweet ever by a Republican senator about a Republican president-elect's nominee. And I have said for a while, if you're looking at Kennedy, Gabbard, or Hegseth, I think the universe of potential no votes is at least double figures and maybe mid-double figures. Doesn't mean there'll be that many votes against them. But I think there's that many who could theoretically vote no for a variety of reasons. And I have Senator Cassidy on that list for Bobby Kennedy. Senator Cassidy, as many of you know, voted for a conviction in the impeachment trial. He's a man of conscience and not afraid to cross Donald Trump. And I think if he thinks, as a medical doctor, that Bobby Kennedy is not the right person to run HHS, I think he will vote no. Continues to be a kind of an assumption that Susan Collins of Maine and Lisa Murkowski of Alaska will vote no on these nominees, and therefore a third and fourth no Republican vote, assuming no Democratic support, would doom them. A couple things about that. Number one, I think that's assuming too much about Collins and Murkowski. The other is John Fetterman, the man who we honor this week with my hoodie wearing, has said he's going to vote for some of the nominees, the Republican president-elect nominees. And I wouldn't be surprised if one of those he voted for was Bobby Kennedy. So we'll see. The map there could get a little hanky. All right. So Trump, we talked about that, the nominees. Greenland continues to roil and broil, and what I predicted would happen has finally happened, which is the New York Times and others have finally gotten some reporters, not necessarily to Greenland, but at least to Denmark, to start writing articles about how the people of Greenland and Denmark feel about the prospect of the United States having some control over Greenland. Hey, Lori, am I allowed to promote tomorrow's show?
Sure.
Sure.
With what I've sent you thus far.
Huh. Well, you promote tomorrow's show. What do we have on the morning meeting tomorrow, Lori?
We have former ambassador to Denmark, Rufus Gifford.
Yes, Rufus Gifford. Thank you, Lori. Rufus Gifford is a very major fundraiser for the Democratic Party. He ran fundraising first for Joe Biden and then Kamala Harris. Very well thought of, very smart guy in the party. And again, was ambassador to Denmark. So he will be here tomorrow morning to talk both about Denmark and Greenland, but also about the future of the Democratic Party. So it'll be a special morning meeting edition of the future of the Democratic Party. So tune in for that. You will not want to miss it. Speaking of the Democratic Party, the Bidens, I don't know if their wheels up yet or not. They were supposed to be, but they were in California. The president's event yesterday was canceled, but it appears the real reason they were in California, nothing wrong with this, was to be present for the birth of their first great-grandchild. Cue picture 5, please. You want to see adorable? We've got adorable. This is the First Lady and the President of the United States with their first ever great-grandchild. Every picture tells a story, don't it? As Rod Stewart said about donuts. That's the picture, I guess, put out by the White House probably, and there you have it. So that happened today also. All right. Now, we have, as I said, we're standing by to see if we hear more from President Trump regarding his meeting with the Republican senators. And if we do, we'll bring that to you. But for now, let's bring in our two guests who we're delighted to have with us and glad for them of making the time. David, let me just make sure you're unmuted.
Yes.
He joins us. Do you mind if I call you a veteran reporter? Is that all right?
I'll take it. I will take
veteran reporter. All right. And Michael LaRosa, who I know likes to be called a veteran Democratic strategist. Glad to have you both here. And I want to start talking about Joe Biden, and we're going to talk about the media. David, I hope you don't consider that a bait and switch, but we'll talk a little bit about Joe Biden. Because I'm sure you both are very familiar with the USA Today interview. Michael is credited by many for being willing to speak truthfully about the Bidens, which is great for the public interest. The media likes it too, but I mostly like to emphasize the public interest. So, Michael, what were your takeaways from the Biden interview with Susan Page, which the White House has suggested is the only print interview, at least, he'll do as he exits here?
Well, I'm glad that they chose Susan. Just anecdotally, I remember on the campaign when I had reached out to Susan, I was scolded because the other side of the house or the campaign was scared of her. So I got into a lot of trouble for reaching out to Susan to attend the First Lady's South Carolina event. I'm glad they got over that. But disappointing, I think, to see what he said about, not disappointing, Mark. I think what he said about misinformation made me a little sad because he had every opportunity to use the bully pulpit and decided not to do it, decided not to use the bully pulpit to defend his own integrity, his own honor, his son, his family, his accomplishments, didn't want to hold press conferences, do media avails, didn't want to do a Super Bowl interview. And I don't think it's actually him. I really don't. But he allowed that culture around him to hide him and not communicate with the voters. And the voters, through polling, told us they didn't want him as the nominee for well over a year and a half. So I don't quite understand. I can't really reconcile how he can be frustrated or have regrets that he didn't combat misinformation when he wasn't actively communicating really much at all.
Yeah, fair point. David, thoughts on the interview overall, but also on Michael's point about Joe Biden's seeming contradiction of not liking the status quo, but not having done much to change it.
I think it was most striking to me that he sort of admitted he couldn't serve another term, even though he said he was able to beat Donald Trump, which I think most sane people believe that both of those were impossible. To me, there was a just sense of exasperation, him throwing his hands up in the air as an old Irishman. Who the hell knows? I mean, I think we all know he would have lost to Donald Trump, possibly in a bigger route. And that in some ways, even though Kamala Harris was a flawed and bad candidate, she preserved narrower majorities in Congress. I think that's what most people believe now. But the quote that just is going to linger with me is that he was running for re-election, and he said on the record he didn't know if he could serve the term. And that is striking. If he would have won re-election, imagine if he would have won, what kind of situation we would be in, given his cognitive ability that's on full display right now.
Okay. Great start. If you want to be in the conversation and you're here on the two-way platform, please raise your electronic hand. As always, we emphasize peace, love, and understanding here on Two-Way. That's not just an Elvis Costello lyric, but actually the ethos of what we believe. Please show respect to everybody. If you have a spirited disagreement, and we're about to hear one from David about yesterday's show, that's great. We're not squelching conversation, and we're not just for centrist moderates and independents, as some people sometimes suggest. We are for everybody. Bernie supporters, MAGA, super MAGA. And the idea is to learn about diverse points of view in a reasoned, sophisticated, long conversation, which we don't believe is on offer very many other places here in the United States of America. So we're glad that you've joined us. And again, and especially if you've never raised your hand to participate in the conversation, we'd love for you to raise your hand to be part of tonight's conversation with our excellent guests. We've got more video of President Trump. Let's go ahead and show that. Again, on Capitol Hill. Do you guys know? I've just a bad memory. Is this the first time he's been on Capitol Hill? No, he was up there dealing with the House a few weeks ago. Right. All right. I remember that now. But it's one of the first few times he's been on Capitol Hill since January 6th of 2021. One of the first.
A couple times.
One of the first. I love weasel phrases like one of the first because it's true. It could have been the 100th time, but it's still one of the first. Guys, do we have that additional video that you told me we had? Here we go. All right. This is Donald Trump and Melania Trump, I believe, paying respect to Jimmy Carter. It has been so interesting to listen to President Trump talk about President Carter because he at times has shown more respect and deference and kind of remarks typical of the president's club, that very exclusive club at any given time. There are very many living people who've been president. And then, of course, in his press conference yesterday, he took more than a few swipes at President Carter, more in line with his rhetoric over the years about him. Okay, we can bring that out. Well, we're still waiting to see if we get any reaction. We don't know how long he plans to meet with Senate Republicans, but if we get any reaction to that, we will bring it to you. I'm wondering, just one more question about Biden, Joe Biden, to our two guests, and then David, I want to turn to your critique of Trump and the media. And Michael, we'll start with you again. Do you anticipate? We know he's supposed to give a farewell address and a foreign policy speech. Do you anticipate? Well, let me ask it a different way. Do you see a through line to the final day actions of Joe Biden here? You would think most presidents I've covered in their final days, they try to do things to shape their legacy, to improve their kind of positioning, to get things checked off the list. Do you see kind of a coherent policy or political messaging coming out of these decisions, or they seem like a series of arbitrary one-offs to you, or something else?
Yeah, I don't know what they are. I've been a little surprised that they didn't start sort of the activating the legacy tour a little sooner and in a more public way, in a more in your face way. I feel like it's been very habitual of them to do things and then not talk about it and then allow the rest of the world to kind of tell the story for them and cast judgments. Like it would be great to know why he pardoned some of the folks that he pardoned on death row. This was a guy who touted his support of the Fraternal Order of Police and his tough on crime positions and always having the support of law enforcement. And I would love to know why he did some of those things. Again, they seem to really have a problem with wanting to communicate in a clear and accessible way in such a contrast to the president-elect. And like, I didn't vote for the president-elect. I never would, but you can't say that that guy doesn't communicate with voters, with people, and doesn't, you mentioned how often he goes to Capitol Hill. I remember in the summer before he dropped out, but during the chaos of June or July, my mom said to me, why doesn't he just go up to Capitol Hill and ask and talk to them himself? So that's a great idea, Mom. Donald Trump does it all the time. He goes and talks to members. No, they sent a BCC email saying he is running and we want your support. An email to members of Congress. That
Michael,
was his way of whipping the vote.
Isn't the answer though
I
to
don't get it.
why didn't he go up himself, and why didn't he speak out more? Isn't the answer that they didn't trust that he had the mental capacity to do it? Isn't that the answer?
Maybe, but the reason why they got mad at me because for the longest time I just kept saying, if we're not going to see him, then every time we do see him, in the rare occasions we do, every little thing he does and says is going to be amplified. And so he won't get the benefit of the doubt the way Trump does on age, because Trump is always out there. Even when he makes mistakes, he's forgiven those mistakes because he's accessible and we know where he stands.
Yeah.
With Biden, they just kept hiding him. And I don't understand for the life of me, the first lady during the primaries, I think maybe I mentioned this to you before, that he had not done a Sunday show for the entire year he was running for president in the primary. And all the candidates were doing, in 2020 now, all the candidates were doing the full Ginsburg, especially in the last couple of weeks leading up to Iowa. And I was reading them off to Jill in the car one day, and she said, well, why doesn't Joe do them anymore? He's been doing them all the time. I said, yeah, he probably has done more Sunday shows than I can remember than anybody else can. I have no idea why in the last political fight of his campaign, he was not talking to the press.
Yeah.
And a couple days later, we got our butts kicked in Iowa, but before the New Hampshire primary, he was booked on a Sunday show.
Yep.
Always when their hand is forced.
Before I turn to David to get his views of the Biden final days, leave aside Pete Buttigieg, the president and the vice president. Who would you say was the single most effective spokesperson in this administration? Not counting Jen Psaki either. Not saying you would necessarily say any of those, but I'm exempting those.
I mean, in the administration?
Yeah.
Or a surrogate?
No, it's someone in the government.
In terms of being a spokesperson and being a good communicator, I always thought John Feiner was really good at it.
Uh-huh.
John
Yeah.
Feiner,
Deputy National Security Advisor.
I always thought he was great as a communicator. Jake is very polished and very good at communicating.
Yeah.
But like obviously Pete is one of the better ones. I think John Fetterman as a voice for the Democratic Party probably represents where is probably the best version of Trump that we have in terms of speaking plainly, authentically, and without fear of offending people. He's probably the best vessel for that.
Yeah. All right, David, what are your kind of 800,000 foot view of the Biden final days?
John Kirby's the best spokesperson.
Yeah, he's pretty good too.
He's really good in the briefings.
Yeah.
I think he's going to talk about policy. The only thing he can talk about, I think the only redeeming thing of his administration is policy, Inflation Reduction Act, chips, infrastructure, like real bills. I mean, this last year was a mess for him. The election, the pardons, Hunter. But if you look to the prior years, they got a lot of policy done. And, will Trump be able to unravel that? We don't know. But I think in his final speeches, if I was crafting what I want him to say and what I want to leave Americans with, is what he's done in those big pieces of legislation that you're going to see 5-10 years down the road, and the legacy will look brighter. And I think he'll reassure the country that we'll survive Trump. We'll be fine. And that's what he said the whole time, even though he warned about democracy during the campaign, used it as a political tool. I think he'll say, look, we'll get through this and we'll recover and we'll be okay.
The press always wants administrations to admit they messed up. And of course, administrations don't want to admit that. On Afghanistan, and David, I'll stay with you. On Afghanistan, on inflation and the border, I don't think you can say the Biden administration was a success. Maybe not as big a failure in some of those areas as their critics say, but can you explain in sort of the arc of the 4 years how they dealt with those things, and whether not being honest about them was part of the reason Donald Trump won?
Yeah, I think immigration was an obvious failure. And Trump said the other day, he believes that's the reason he won, even more so than the economy. And I think personnel has a lot to do with it. I think Mayorkas had a lot to do with it. I think people you put in cabinet positions and high-level positions. I mean, the president can't have his eyes on everything, but in those early years, he should have had somebody in those early briefings saying the border is a problem. Like we need to do something about this. And they didn't act on it until much too late. And that was a failure. Afghanistan, I am not a foreign policy analyst. I think a lot of people say it was the right decision, actually, but that it was implemented wrong. And I think there needed to be more explaining on that. That's a trickier one that I think is above my pay grade as a political reporter, to be honest. But immigration was the clearest failure of the administration. And, I think there will be many pages of books just written about that issue and how it consumed him, and that they didn't nip it in the bud until much, much too late. And it took down his the vice president.
But
Michael.
Mark, a lot of administrations make mistakes and a lot of administrations mess up. The best ones acknowledge them and take responsibility, and they're usually rewarded for that. I mean, John Kennedy was, Ronald Reagan was.
But when has Trump admitted a mistake?
I'm not talking about Trump, but
okay.
Look, I'll just want to answer some of your questions. I mean, Afghanistan, he campaigned on getting out of Afghanistan. It was Donald Trump's deal that we took and executed it. The problem was, and it is a complex story, and it's one that can't be told tonight, but there's lots of public reporting out there about what the previous administration had done to choke off the visas, the special visas, and create a backlog that made it very hard to get people out in time, combined with our intelligence that was, well, off, to say the least, as to where the Taliban was advancing. Should the president have delayed? Probably. I'm more of a hawk, so that's one thing I stayed away from, because I thought we should still be there in the first place. But he campaigned on getting out, so I believe he believes that it was a success in the end. Again, with inflation, all you have to do is acknowledge the problem. When you acknowledge the problem, you get a lot more credit for it. But there was a refusal, instead calling it Bidenomics and trying to own it. Well, come to the Lehigh Valley in Bethlehem and Allentown, Pennsylvania, where it went Obama, Trump, Biden, Trump. I mean, yeah. Bethlehem Steel, they blamed Reaganomics for bringing down Bethlehem Steel, which was a global icon of industry and manufacturing. To call something Biden, and first of all, Reaganomics was coined after Reagan left, and it was he was trolled by the media for it, or the media dubbed it. It wasn't them. And so I never understood branding something with a negative connotation when the economy was never completely settled in the first place.
Yeah. I want to get one more question, then David, I want you to talk about Trump and the media, and I'll explain why I think it's so important. Michael, what were the circumstances under which you left the administration?
On my own. Oh,
On your own.
my own.
Okay.
I mean,
thought so. I thought so.
Yeah.
But here's the question: can you name a single person Joe Biden fired in 4 years?
No. And
I've never heard of a presidency, even a one-term presidency, where no one was fired.
yeah. Oh, I mean, I'm not saying that incompetency or mistakes don't deserve, like, yeah.
No. But what I'm saying is,
It rolled after
like
Afghanistan.
he didn't fire his HHS secretary. He didn't. I mean, his Homeland Security secretary. He didn't fire his Pentagon secretary after he went AWOL and went to hospital without telling the White House. He didn't fire anybody.
Mark, my honest belief is because of the way that they hire. I think that they were too, and you can go back to what Dave pointed out about personnel. They are scared. They accurately represent what people have characterized as a cultural problem in the Democratic Party, because they are too scared to offend certain interest groups. So they won't fire or hire certain people as a result.
Yeah.
So the president didn't get the people he wanted.
I just think an administration where mistakes were made, as we say, the passive voice, for no one to be fired is just incredible.
Yeah, and like I thought that about the campaign. I didn't understand. I said to somebody in February of 2020, I mean, after we were just getting demolished, just humiliated. The Bidens did not expect to get humiliated in Iowa. They put everything into Iowa. I can tell you from running around with his wife, that was not something they saw coming. I don't know why heads didn't roll, but the person I was traveling with said to me, he would rather, well, I said something like, why doesn't he explain things this way? And he said, well, that's why you should be over there working with them. I said, well, no, thank you. But I said, well, speaking of, why doesn't he get rid of some of the people who are giving him the advice that he's taking, because it doesn't seem to be working? And they said he would rather lose with those people than attempt to win with a new group.
Yeah. Loyalty is great, but I just don't get it. All right. So if you want to get in the conversation, please raise your hand. We'll get to you soon. David, last night, John Podorz was here. Unfortunately, John's not here tonight to defend or explain, but you took issue with the things John said, some of which I agreed with. And I kind of agree with both of you, but if you would explain what John said, and I'm sure you'll characterize it fairly, certainly to the best of your ability, explain what John said and annotate and explain your disagreement. And I'll just say, I'm not as interested in the media as a story as many people are, including many people who are part of this community, but it's super important. And I think it's super important right now because, again, I'll repeat what I always say. Covering Donald Trump is really hard. It's harder than running against him. And I think we all, whether we're journalists or citizens, we all have to figure out what the democracy requires to cover him in the right way at a time when John and I believe the media is extraordinarily mismatched. And John and I believe Trump cares less about what the media thinks than he did 8 years ago. David.
Yeah, I had 2 points of contention with your arguments. You guys were talking about the press conference yesterday, the hour Trump press conference he did in Mar-a-Lago. And John said something to the effect of, the media's taking the bait, Trump's running over them. They're talking about Greenland. Why are they asking all these questions about Greenland? And I'm sitting there watching this. I wasn't at this press conference, but I watched it twice. And I actually found the questions to be thorough, substantial, smart follow-ups were had. That is not always the case. I'm not a blanket defender of the mainstream media, but I watched this presser twice, and I just didn't understand what John was saying, that Trump's railroading the media. I mean, he got asked really tough questions that elicited substantive answers on Ukraine policy, and he kept saying, Greenland, why are you taking the bait on Greenland? Donald Trump is talking about Greenland every day. The job of a reporter, if I'm their assignment editor, you follow up, you push him. There's a very smart follow-up asked during this press conference that said, Mr. President, do you have a team in place for how you might acquire Greenland? And he said no. Now, that's a small detail, and you know this, Mark. You slip it in your story later to show that maybe it's not as serious. Maybe it is all bluster. Greenland's probably bluster. The Panama Canal is probably bluster. But as a reporter, that's the day's story, and you probe it and you put the context into the story that he tried this before, it didn't work, it may be a distraction. And, you know, I just think that reporters actually came off good in this instance, and that it was a good press conference for reporters. And I think Trump came off good, and it wasn't personal. He didn't call anybody nicknames. He was substantive. The reporters were substantive. So I disagreed on that point. And then the second point that I think you made and underscored about Trump not caring about the mainstream media, which, you know, I just couldn't disagree more. He first of all, the fact that he had this press conference shows that he's back to wanting the attention of the New York Times, NBC News, ABC News. He loves it. He won the election. He doesn't need to cater to 20-year-olds who listen to 8 hours of Joe Rogan a week. The last thing he can do as a crowning legacy is to win the affirmation of the legacy, whatever you want to call it, legacy, mainstream, lamestream media. And I think it was most telling that he called on David Sanger, who is the most institutional reporter in Washington. He gave him 4 questions. He didn't give it to Breitbart. He didn't give it to OAN or Newsmax. He gave it to David Sanger. Then he went to a CBS reporter. So to me, I think I would bet that Donald Trump does 5 times the more press conferences with mainstream media outlets than he ever does a podcast. I think that was a smart campaign tactic. I think they used it well. I think it was a mistake that Kamala Harris didn't do it. It was all smart. But Trump now does not need voters anymore. He's unencumbered by voters. And I think just what you've seen, what was his first post-election interview? He didn't meet the press. A dying Sunday show that I don't even watch anymore. I think it's past its prime. But I think to him, a 78-year-old man, he wants the validation of meet the press. He spoke in the press conference about he still watches Fox News, but I'm not allowed to talk about it. So I just don't think Trump is ever going to not want the affirmation of the mainstream media. And I think the mainstream media will become more relevant in his second term because it will be his crowning jewel if he can get the New York Times to write a story in 2027 that, hey, we were wrong. This guy accomplished a hell of a lot.
Okay, I know what I would think about those 2 things, but Michael, what are your thoughts on those 2 points?
Yeah, I think it's this. I agree. I mean, I agree with Dave. I think that he is driven by. I think about it in my day job in Washington and like working with the private sector because people can't wait till he's president in the private. People in the private sector and business can't wait because you can talk to him and negotiate with him, and they know that he's persuadable. I just can't tell you how much it seems like he cares what people think about him. And he doesn't want to hurt businesses that come to him and say, we need your help. He's very, I just think that the guy likes iconic American culture, and television is part of that. Yeah. That's why a lot of the big businesses don't want, like, people thought business would be scared because he's so tumultuous or that he's inconsistent or that you could wake up one day and he could be coming after you. There's good and bad to it, but that's mostly what they see in him, is that he is a traditionalist. And when it comes to the media, it's no different. He wouldn't be running for president or anything without legacy, if it weren't for legacy media. He doesn't see a podcast or a NBC News as an either or. They're both an audience, and that's what he craves the most.
Yeah.
And that's why Democrats, I don't understand why they keep saying why she didn't do this, X, Y, and Z. You have to be everywhere. Why would you alienate one over the other? Doesn't make any. Why would you alienate people who read the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or or Joe Rogan.
So excellent. David, here's what I think. On your first point, I think the questions were above average for the White House press corps, without a doubt. I think what John said, I think, and what I agree with is they were in some instances, but not in all, but in some instances, I think they were too uh, um, uh, reflective of Trump's point of view. That they were letting him decide what they asked about. But I agree with you; they asked about a lot of things. So I generally agree with you on that. On the second point, I hope we didn't make it seem all or nothing. Trump doesn't not care about the legacy media, as you said. No one who does meet the press in their first post-election interview can be said not to care about the legacy or the dominant media. And calling on David Sanger makes him happy because it makes him feel like a real president, Pinocchio, because David Sanger's sitting there asking him substantive questions. I think my point of view, and I won't speak for John here, although I think he and I are simpatico on this, he doesn't care in the sense that he's not going to live or die based on what they say. Of course, he wants to be crowned by them. There's no doubt that that's his preference. But if they turn on him, having tried to put him in prison for 4 years, if they turn on him, it's not going to make or break him the way it would have. He's not going to be anguished over it. He's not going to say to his team, we need to get the New York Times back on my side because they've written 3 bad stories in a row. I think he's just going to say, let's do something else because they're back to being the resistance. And that's different than 8 years ago.
I don't know. I think that's always how he's been. I mean, don't you think he's always been tough with media and
always, but
you know this, Mark. I mean,
he needed them. He needed them psychologically and practically.
He was
8
just
years
as
ago.
tough. Remember that? I mean, the interviews you did with him, the early interviews you did with him in Trump Tower, he was combative about stuff. And the Katie Tur interview, he was rough from the beginning. He'll be rough right off the bat to mainstream media.
Yeah.
I just think that in the end, he wants to prove I was like, you guys were wrong about me. I'm
100%.
actually going to get this all done. You're going to have to eat your print.
100% he thinks that, and 100% he'll be tough, and he's always tough. What I'm saying is, 8 years ago, if Katie Tur or Maggie Haberman were not reporting what he wanted, and if they were unfair, he would care about it in a way. He would say to his staff, "We need to fix this." He would call them himself. He would
write notes. He would write handwritten notes.
Yeah. And my sense from talking to people and listening to him is he still cares. He still will cater to them. He still will wish their coverage was different, but it's not the same degree at all of focus. If it happens, great. If it doesn't, he's got other places to go. And again, his view is they tried to put him in prison. So there's a rupture there about his kind of romanticized view of the role they play and of the individuals, right? That's, I think, another big difference. In 2016, he would say what a lot of presidents say, which is, I don't really like the media, but I like the individual reporters. And it was true. My sense is there are a very high number of individual reporters now that he doesn't like, because, again, he thinks they tried to put him in prison. And so it's just not as romanticized. It's not what it was in 2016 when, after he won, he went and did Ed boards at the New York Times and Vanity Fair. Like, he's not doing that.
Yeah, we'll see. I mean, for me, that's a little too early to know. I'll want to know how many reporters are down at Mar-a-Lago on weekends doing long form interviews for books, because he did a lot of that. He does a lot of off the record stuff.
Yeah.
Behind closed doors, he's very charming to reporters. He likes them. Now, then he goes on stage and says enemies. And then after the rally, right, he points at the camera banks. And then after the rally, he has a reporter, you meet him in a restaurant. I met him at a restaurant in New Hampshire. He's very charming and very nice. And I don't know what's coming. Maybe this is a changed guy and he's going to shut the media out. I don't, it's hard for me to believe that a 78-year-old man really isn't going to want it now that he got the Ruby Crown. He's had his second term. So now he can mold this, and I think he's going to want to court these. I think he's going to have David Sanger in the Oval Office for that in-depth interview for that New York Times Sunday spread. I think that's going to happen. That's where I guess our disagreement is. I mean,
Well-
maybe he'll shut it out. Maybe this term will be different, but that's, I guess, on Susie.
Yeah, I don't think, I think he will have David Sanger in, but I don't think he'll shut it out until he's disappointed. And then rather than doubling down on trying to be charming and win them over, I think he'll say, F you, I'm gonna find somebody else to talk to. That's what I think that's the basis of our disagreement. And you're right, we don't know yet. I just see the focus that they have as channeling his interests. It's just not like it was before. But it was so Pavlovian before. It was like, oh no, Maureen wrote a bad column about me. I need to send her a note and, you know, circle the things I didn't like. I just don't think he's going to be doing that with too many people anymore. All right, brilliant. Thank you both. Stay with us. Here we go. Ray Marcano, my friend from Ohio. Dayton makes, the world takes. Ray, Happy New Year. Welcome in. Your question or comment for Michael and for Dave.
Happy New Year, Mark, and everybody else. I have two questions based on what I heard, and I hope I heard it right because I took notes. I believe that it was David who mentioned that, you know, obviously everybody at the press conference knew that this was a bunch of bluster and what Trump was doing. If you're a journalist who covers Trump, you know that to be the case. What I wonder is how that relates to the public's perception of media. And please excuse me, folks, this is just a little bit of inside baseball. But the New York Times back in 2016 announced that they were going to literally announce in 2016 that they were going to note every time Trump, quote unquote, lied. And they would use a term like bluster. They would go ahead and say it was a bunch of bluster. A bunch of other of the mainstream media properties would not. They would stick to the current, they would stick to the standard. Trump said this, Trump said that. Do you think that how media plays, how they approach to him can confuse the public?
David.
In other words, making sure that one says, these folks aren't fair, these folks are.
You mean how they write about his falsehood?
How they frame it. Yes, how they frame it.
Yeah, I mean,
yes.
that's always tough. I mean, some editors just don't want to say lie, you know, or they'll say, you know, there's a story I read today about his claim about the Panama Canal and China having control. And I think it was the Times, the Journal, just basically had one line, you know, comma, which is not true. You know, China doesn't control the Panama Canal. That's always difficult. And, you know, to the top of your point, though, you know, I actually was taking a lot of what he said seriously at the press conference. I think in the stories, you get more nuance and you explain that, look, he's tried the Greenland thing before. This could be a distraction. This could be, you know, this is unlikely to happen. And you quote an insider on background from the, you know, Trump official saying, like, look, this is probably not going to happen. And that gives it context. But I think for the reporters in the room that day, their job is to pressure him and try to get little bits of more information that on those topics. And I think they covered a lot of topics. I mean, they talked about January 6th as well. They talked about the hostages and, you know, his comment that hell to pay. I mean, that was striking. Does anybody think Trump's going to go to war in the Middle East on January 21st if the hostages aren't out? That could be all bluster. But, you know, we got to treat it seriously and then provide the context. But to your question of how we write it, that's on individual newsrooms, and every newsroom's a little bit different on how far they're willing to go. Is this a lie? Is it a fabrication? Is it untrue? Or do we just say others say this?
Yeah, and I was just wondering if that difference, and I realize that there's a difference between newsrooms, obviously, but if that difference confuses the public and leaves an impression on the public when the New York Times says, I'm not picking on the Times, they just do, when the New York Times says lie, and the Associated Press or ABC or NBC says he said this, does it give the impression of bias?
Well, I think it leads to confusion, and you can always then you pick through your partisan lens usually and say, well, this one's got it wrong because my leaning's the other way. You're never going to get unification through all the media, and especially what we were talking about before, the explosion of alternative media and Substacks and, you know, new media and podcasts. You know, like, you're never going to get a through line standard for how you cover Donald Trump. That's sort of the riddle we're all dealing with.
Michael.
No, I don't have anything to add. I agree with Dave, but I just think it's a problem that is sort of reflected in the fractured media environment we have. There's just the lines are blurred between editorializing and stating facts, and whether it's cable news or whether it's print news or podcasts or digital or whatever. I just think that it's I think it is confusing. I think it's a problem, but I don't know if it's specifically a Trump problem. I don't know if that's the case. I think, yeah.
I'm sorry, Ray. Did you have a second question?
I did, but I'll pass since I've been on long enough. Thank you very much.
All right, Ray. Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you for coming on. Mr. Schleem, welcome back. Happy New Year to you. Tell folks who don't know where you are what's on your mind, please.
Hi, Mark. Happy New Year to you guys. Yesterday, I think Hogan was on, and he mentioned that someone came up to him and said that they love watching him on the show. That person was me. Ran into him at a party here. But I was listening very intently to what everyone was saying, and I think something that we're missing is like the media kind of learned a lesson that the Democrats also learned this election, which was that no matter how much you're going to go out and say that Trump is fascist and Trump is Hitler, that the American people spoke on November 8th. And at the end of the day, that they have to learn that their numbers are going down, their ratings are going down. Everyone's taking a pay cut in the news media. And so at the end of the day, like people like, I mean, Bob Iger decided to settle $15 million with Trump. I don't think the media has the energy nor the intention anymore to play resistance like the Democrats did after his first election. I think that's a big like change that's going to happen, and we're going to see that happening more and more, which started with this press conference. I saw someone in the chat say that this press conference was somewhat of a realignment of the media's intentions to cover the Trump 2.0 administration. I agree. It's just that at these times, the corporations are saying that resistance isn't working. That's not what the American people voted for. They saw the mandate that the Democrats saw as well. And the media kind of, since they're in the same camp as the Democratic Party, have to learn the same lesson that they did. And so that's what I think that we saw over here. But other than that, this conversation is very, very interesting. And thank you so much for having me.
Okay, thank you for that. Michael, thoughts?
Well, it's you're painting the media with one broad brush, right? So
the mainstream media, I'm sorry, not podcasts, not new media, but ABC network television, cable news channels who were fervently anti-Trump the first time.
Okay, so that's hard to kind of, I don't know. I mean, I guess there are certain examples you could cite that would lead you to paint a brush of an entire network. Like, it's very easy to do that with MSNBC. I don't think they're making any changes at all, from what I can tell. I said to a media executive at that network last spring, I said, "Do you think Donald Trump has a chance to win?" And they said, "Yeah, of course." And I said, "Well, what are you going to tell your audience if he does win, after you have been saying the polls are wrong, the data is wrong, the information is wrong?" Again, it's the reason why the Biden people get mad at me, because I didn't understand why all of a sudden we hate polls and why we hate information. Well, we loved them 4 years ago. Let's just do better. Let's just have a better strategy, right? And try to drive the news and fix it. But I don't think that it's fair to paint the entire media as the resistance. I just think it's what we were talking about earlier. It's a fractured media environment because the lines are blurred between editorializing and fact-based reporting. Nobody wants to do fact-based reporting. They want their opinions.
Yeah, David.
I agree, Michael, but respectfully, I mean, MSNBC is about to be sold off soon. I mean, that shows that capitalism is working within the media. And I mean, when I say the resistance, I mean, Trump 1.0, the administration 2017, 2021, arguably the media was against him every single day, except when he bombed Qasem Soleimani, arguably, you know?
Well, I just like one last thing on, I take your point about the media, and that's something we probably can't finish tonight, but the mandate part, I think it's also really important that you understand that this wasn't a mandate for the president. He doesn't have a mandate. If he had a mandate, you know, he wouldn't be having problems with his nominees. His party would have won the 5 Senate seats that the Democrats won. But he didn't. And in fact, Democrats gained a seat in the House. So there is no mandate. And I think it's important Republicans start learning the lessons that the Biden people had to never learned, was that we misread our mandate from Democratic voters and from the American people and from the midterms. They misread a lot. I would be careful with this mandate term because I don't see a mandate.
Respectfully, Michael, I mean, the Senate is a very different conversation. We could save that for another day. Each of those candidates were running separate
I would just
races to
say,
Trump, but
I would just
Trump
say,
won the popular vote in
right, well, that's,
2024.
I don't
Like,
think he,
after 8 years of him in the news, 10 years maybe in the news, and everyone's saying this guy's a fascist, this
but
guy's the worst coming since Hitler. He
But-
won the popular
All right,
vote. Like, that is a mandate.
hold
Wait a
on.
second.
I don't want to try to solve the question of whether it was
Yeah.
a landslide or a mandate, because everybody's going to see that a different way. And I want to let David respond to the original point, please.
Yeah, I would on the media. I think most people, when they're talking about the media, they talk about television media, and that as a writer, I sort of push back on that. Not to give like David Sanger the biggest two-way plug here, because I'm mentioning again, but he's the first reporter got all those questions. I think if you read him, he wasn't part of the resistance. He is a major reporter on foreign affairs. If something goes on in the world, I'm reading him. Now, I'm sure you could find maybe a paragraph of the snarky, maybe paragraph about Donald Trump, but he's the type of reporter that was in that room that was like doing the work. So I don't think you should cast everyone sort of in that room of that press conference as part of like the resistance that have changed their tune. David Sanger probably would ask those same questions or very similar questions in 2015, in 2021, and in 2025. And there's a lot of reporters that you don't see on TV gabbing and, on cable that do that work. But I think when people talk about the media and lament the media, they're usually talking about Fox and CNN and MSNBC, depending on what political perspective they're coming from. It's always television when people complain about the media.
They complain a lot about the Washington Post and the New York Times.
Yeah, you're right. But it's always, I mean, from what I think you polled the masses.
Dave said it much better than I was able to.
It's MSNBC and Fox, and that's all you're right. They have shrinking value. But they're still on television, so they're just more apparent because of the visual piece.
There aren't a lot of reporters like David Singer. I would just submit. So you're right. I think you're right to single him out, and I think the way you characterized him is right. But I think if you take all the reporters, we'll go back to the New York Times, our favorite whipping paper. If you go to all the reporters who write for the New York Times who have written about Donald Trump in the last 8 years, I think you'd find in almost everyone but David Sanger's copy snarky paragraphs, and some substantially more than that. I can't think of anybody else who I would say, you know what, I'm going to go back and look and maybe we'll find one.
I think Jonathan Swan is very fair.
He is, but he hasn't been there for the 8 years. But yeah, I agree with you about that.
Yeah, I mean, I could list others, but I guess we could split hairs over this.
If
But
I can ask one more question.
Go beyond the New York Times. There's other reporters at major places that I think do a good job. That Mark, I think you would say so as well.
Yeah.
But there's also great reporters that aren't that are now on Substack and doing other things.
Yeah.
I'm not.
Yeah.
I just think my point is television. Get beyond television. When you have your bias, I would just pull out. Don't ascribe everything to what you see on MSNBC and Fox.
Yeah, good, very good point. All right, one last really quick question, please.
Mark, Michael and David, I'm sorry. What do you guys think of Sean's idea of, like, for example, podcasts and podcast hosts sending reporters to the White House press corps, and the kind of culture of the White House press corps changing, where they have their meetings and everything? What do you guys think about that idea? Bringing in the new media kind of and adding on to the voice.
I think it's good, and I think they'll do some of it. I think there's, the briefing room itself has a space-time distance challenge because there's only so many people you can fit in there. But I think the notion that the legacy places should be privileged because they've been privileged in the past doesn't make any sense.
I agree, Mark.
I think they need a formula for not just size of audience, but diversity of points of view. But I don't want them to give seats to people who won't ask hard questions. I think the public interest demands that people ask hard questions. And if they give the seats to people who are just going to say, is Donald Trump the greatest president of all time or just one of the greatest presidents of all time? I think the people should object to that. But I think the reality is that you can't expect the Trump administration to be happy to be covered by people and organizations who tried to send Donald Trump to prison for 4 years. I just think it's not just about human nature. It's about living up to the expectations they set for the people who voted for him in many cases in no small part because they didn't like the way he was covered. They thought it was unfair. And in many instances, it was.
Oh,
which
and
is
it'll
not
go a
to-
long way to your earlier point,
Yeah.
Mark, about whether Trump has changed and really has a different view of
Yeah.
the media. If he reorders
Yeah,
the briefing room and kicks
100%.
out establishment orgs and replaces them with new media, with podcasters, then that is a sign that your theory.
The rumor, I can't confirm this. The rumor is that the ABC News front row seat is going to two-way. We'll see. We'll see if that turns out to be true. Thank you for the questions. Appreciate it. Good to have you back. Gentlemen, so grateful to you both for making time to join us to be part of tonight's program. Very grateful to you, and I hope you'll both come back on a regular basis, as always. So thank you for that.
Thanks.
Good to see you both. All right, Happy New Year. All right, so tomorrow morning, as I said, on the morning meeting, we're going to have a special guest, Mr. Rufus Gifford, former ambassador of the United States to Denmark and a longtime senior official in the Democratic Party, one of the best fundraisers in the history of the Democratic Party. So we'll talk about the Democrats, and we'll also talk about the acquisition of Greenland. That's at 9 a.m. tomorrow. And then tomorrow night here on this program, we're going to be unveiling a new segment called The Diner that we'll explain to you, but it's going to be a new way of sampling public opinion that we don't believe exists anywhere else. And it's extremely exciting to me. And it'll be hopefully a regular part of our coverage. So come and learn about that. We're going to be talking about Bobby Kennedy Jr., RFKJ, and his view of vaccines. And the idea of this segment is to expose yourself to a point of view you may not have considered before. As I said, I'm super excited about it. I think it's going to be a very consistent with what we do here every night, but in a way that's organized around a particular issue, and with a lot of really good data before we start talking, and then even more data after. It'll make more sense to you when you see it tomorrow. So I'll see you at 9 a.m. Eastern Time for the morning meeting, and then 6 p.m. tomorrow night for two-way tonight. Thank you for watching again. Thanks to Michael and David for joining, and thank you for those who asked questions. I'll see you in a few hours. Good night.